I'm going to introduce to you one of my very favorite colleagues, Dr. Sharon Jarvis, who's associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies here in the Moody College. And I believe that she's going to be leading a discussion for you. I'm sorry, I think I'm a little early, so I think they're all looking at each other going, I thought I had 4 minutes still. So. Yes, so Sharon, please. Am I right that I should hand off to you at this point? Okay, absolutely. Very good. All right.
Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome. And is the mic? We're delighted that you're all here, and we're delighted to welcome our folks who are watching from home. It's a great excitement to introduce our first panel, 2014 Hot Topics and a Look Ahead. We have 4 terrific panelists. First, we will welcome Ross Ramsey, the executive editor of no, excuse me. We will not first. Oh, terrific. In the spirit of someone who is coming to us from Indiana with the lowest turnout in the country, we will turn our attention to Professor Josh Scacco from Purdue University.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to talk about one of the first big hot topics that permeated this election season, and that is voter identification, looking specifically at what were some of the effects of the messages that were in the environment this election campaign. Just a couple of thank yous and acknowledgements first. I'd like to acknowledge 2 of my research partners on this, Regina Lawrence and Ori Tenenbaum. They have been wonderful in terms of helping to make sure that this research comes together for this presentation today. Also just want to briefly thank the Moody College of Communication and the Annette Strauss Institute for their support of this particular research. So this study looked at what is happening with some of the messages that voters are hearing in the message environment in Texas in particular. So I want to give you a brief overview of the past month of voter identification. First, voter identification laws are nothing new in the United States. In 2005, one of the first voter identification laws was signed into law in Indiana. As Regina Lawrence talked about today, Indiana was also at the bottom of the list in terms of voter turnout yesterday. But Indiana led the way in terms of voter identification, in terms of signing these into law. Since then, a number of other states have also enacted voter registration or voter identification requirements leading up through the 2010, 2012, and 2014 elections. Just in the past month, though, voter identification has faced a number of legal hurdles here in Texas in particular. So on October 9th, U.S. District Court issued a stay indicating that the voter ID law would not be in effect in the November election. The Attorney General, Greg Abbott, also a candidate for governor, as you can see on the screen, you can't see it at the bottom, the Attorney General sought a remedy in the Fifth Circuit, asking for clarification on how the law should be implemented, if at all, based on the district court's decision, and that was October 10th. During that time, and we were in the midst of this research at that time, there was a lot of uncertainty that counties in Texas were facing. This, for example, was a memo that was broadcast from Bruce Alfont here in Travis County, and this was sent out by the League of Women Voters. Essentially, at this time, no one knew whether or not voter ID would be in effect. For that reason, Travis County was advising individuals to still get a voter ID anyways. As you can see, you may need a voter ID. You may need an ID to vote. October 14th, the Fifth Circuit issues a stay of the district court's opinion. What that essentially means is that voter ID goes into effect again. Then what happens is an emergency appeal is filed before the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court on October 18th indicates that a voter ID will stay in effect at least through the midterm election. with 3 dissents from Justices Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan. Obviously, this is something that will continue to be debated in terms of the legal remedies and the legal outcomes of this. Voter ID is not settled law in the state of Texas. It was just allowed to go forward for the midterm election based on the proximity of the legal challenges to the election. So we wanted to understand what was it that individuals were hearing, and then also what were some of the effects of these particular messages that individuals were hearing as they were thinking about their voting choice. First, to give you an idea, and apologies for some of the formatting issues, opinion on the voter ID law is actually decidedly decided. At least the Court of Public Opinion has already said, according to the Texas poll released last month, that there's widespread support for voter identification laws in Texas. It's favored by a 2-to-1 ratio in Texas. So in terms of public opinion has already come down in favor of this particular law. In terms of the messages that were out there, we looked particularly at 4 messages to understand how is it that individuals were reacting and looking at some of the building blocks of participation and of how individuals were affected. So we looked first at 2 different fraud messages. The first is the fraud message that says voter ID prevents voter fraud. And this argument rests on the notion that without voter ID, the election system is insecure and open to potential fraud. The other message we tested was the converse of that, which is that voter ID is unnecessary because fraud is rare. For this particular message, it rests on the argument that something like between 2000 and 2010, there were approximately 1 billion ballots cast in the United States, federal, state, and local, 1 billion ballots, and I think 55 cases of legal voter fraud in terms of what was prosecuted. So this is what proponents of this message talk about. In terms of voter ID and magnitude, we looked at 2 different messages as well. First, we called this the no big deal message. This is voter ID is no big deal. Individuals need an ID to purchase alcohol. They need an ID to drive. They need an ID to purchase firearms. So this basically equates voting with other activities that individuals engage in on a day-to-day basis. The other message we termed was the big deal frame. And this is eligible voters will be denied access to voting if they don't have a voter ID. And this talks about the fact that there are barriers to individuals getting voter ID in Texas, particularly among younger individuals, especially college-age individuals, the elderly, and minority voters as well. So we looked at these 4 messages, and we wanted to understand how were trust in government and internal and external efficacy affected by hearing these messages. So we were actually in the field last week with this experiment. So this is new data. We were in the field between October 27th and November 2nd. We did a survey with 544 Texans, and you can see our sample up there. We sought to make sure that we had a relatively nice sample of individuals that would represent potentially the midterm electorate, but also around the census. We ended up with a sample that was a little bit heavy on males, but also individuals that we had approximately 30% of individuals in the sample who were Hispanic, 11% who were African Americans as well. So, and we tested 4 different messages, the 4 different messages that I just talked about. First, to give you an idea of awareness, we had 2 awareness questions. The first was, have you heard about voter ID? Anything in the past 6 months? Have you heard anything about voter ID? 81% of our survey respondents said that they had heard something. We have very, very rich data as well that we have yet to analyze, where individuals told us what they had heard about it. That's the next step in this research, so we can't share with you yet what they said. But nevertheless, 81% of our sample talked about they had heard something about it. We then asked whether or not individuals had heard about legal challenges to the voter identification law. And again, we have about a 55-45 yes-no split. So we saw here that there definitely was awareness, at least among our sample of individuals in this experiment, about voter ID in Texas. So this was something that individuals knew about. The first big outcome we looked at was external efficacy. This is a very, very fancy word that essentially means, are you able to impact the government? Are government officials caring about you as voters, about citizens? And can you affect what government officials do? This is this idea of external efficacy. It's a building block of things like political participation, especially voting, and especially civic engagement as well. So what we found was, and the table's blocking up here, but if you take a look, what we found was that individuals in the no fraud, the individuals who received the no fraud message, and again, this was the message that said, there's no fraud. There's no fraud in the United States or in Texas. Voter ID is unnecessary. So this would be probably an argument that a Democratic point of view would put forward. Actually significantly reduced external efficacy. So just bringing up the fact that there is no voter fraud. Bringing up the fact that these laws are unnecessary actually has a negative effect on external efficacy. As well, one of the big, I would argue, Republican arguments as well, the no big deal argument, that that voter ID is no big deal because individuals have to purchase a number of things with an ID. Why should they not have to as well show an ID to vote? Also had a significantly negative effect on external efficacy. And what we're talking about here is drops in external efficacy of about 1/4 of a point. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, when we are talking about civic health metrics that are already low, one of the things that we should be concerned about is any messages that could potentially affect one of the building blocks of political participation. And what we see here is that, yes, indeed, one of the building blocks is very much affected. We looked at 2 other ones as well. We found no effect of these messages on trust in government. If you were watching any of the election returns last night, there was a lot of talk in terms of the exit polls about individuals, how much did they trust government or not. And we actually looked at this in terms of individuals who reported that they trust the government to do what is right, as well as trust local election officials to manage elections. And what we found were no changes in terms of trust in government based on the message individuals received. In terms of internal efficacy is, again, just a very, very big word. That means, are you knowledgeable enough about politics? Do you believe you are knowledgeable enough about politics? It's an internal metric of your ability as a citizen. And we found no changes in terms of internal efficacy. So in terms of overviews, we found a significant change in terms of external efficacy, the belief that individuals can affect government, the belief that government officials care about them, but we didn't find any changes related to trust in government and internal efficacy. So a couple of the big takeaways I think that for all of us to consider here today. One is that we need to be thinking about the messages that are out there, that are being put out by both sides, by 3 sides, by 4 sides, and how these might be influencing individuals, not even just as they vote, but 2 or 3 steps before the voting process. Because again, we're talking here about important metrics that lead individuals to vote or not, lead individuals to participate or not. And what you see here is that in some ways, even before we get to this question of whether or not individuals turned out, we need to be asking ourselves as well, what are their attitudes before going into the polling booth that are leading them to stay home or not? And I think we're starting to see evidence, at least in terms of our research, that regardless of the side that individuals put themselves on in this debate, the messages on both sides are having an effect, though it might not necessarily be the effect that they want. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sharon Jarvis, and I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Scacco. It is now our pleasure to invite all of the panelists up to the table where we will have a roundtable discussion on these hot topics. And so, Dr. Scacco, go ahead and head on up. We're also joined by Ross Ramsey, the executive editor of the Texas Tribune, Dr. Sharon Navarro from the Department of Political Science at UTSA, and Ed Espinoza, the executive director of the Texas Research Institute. So we will head up and move into some hot topics.
Chair goes 7 across.
And I will go ahead and turn the first question to the panel at large, but Dr. Navarro perhaps in particular. Earlier we learned about some data with regard to the Latino vote. Dr. Lawrence shared that the Latino vote is lower than other demographics we saw in the slide. So Dr. Navarro and everyone, talk to us about Latino turnout in the past, in 2014, and possibly toward the future.
Latino voter turnout is going to be incredibly important. We live in a large state, 35 to 38% of the Texas population is Latino, expected to grow to almost 40% of the Texas population. What made the Latino vote incredibly important was the election of Barack Obama. And what we learned was that Latinos cannot elect a candidate by themselves as a single group. They can elect a candidate when they coalesce with other ethnic and racial groups. In this past election, we learned that political culture was incredibly important. We had a historic experience with Latina candidates. The first time in American history where we had 4 Latinas run for the number 2 spots in different states, in large states that have large Hispanic populations. 3 of the 4 had a mixed gender combination. 3 of the 4 lost the election. It went to party. National context matters here. With respect to Latinos in large states, it's expensive. And if you are a female expecting to run in a large state where we have a state that is historically unfriendly to Latinos and is perhaps stuck in a traditional individualistic culture where we like to see Latinas and minorities working in leadership positions in the legislature, but have a difficult time perhaps conceiving that they can actually lead a state. We're much more comfortable with them in legislative politics. They have that perception that they have to struggle against. So it's money. It's Leticia Vanderpute raised over $7 million. Patrick raised double that. It's a large state. When you have external organizations coming into a state trying to turn it blue, they have to understand the political culture. When they go knocking door to door, you have to understand who you're dealing with. And you have to be ready to promote both candidates, not one candidate. So the outreach and the motivation to engage Latinos wasn't there. However, when you look at the data, Latinos, even though they may differ with Republicans, particularly over the issue of immigration, it's not a deal breaker for them. They have less trust with Democrats, particularly because Barack Obama failed to deal with immigration, and they don't expect him to deal with signing an executive order to deal with deportation. So they don't really see a difference in the two parties, but they're more likely, just slightly, going to lean towards Republicans. And when we know that at presidential levels, Latinos don't necessarily stick to party, but rather if they like you as a candidate, right? And we all learned about this with George Bush. He had that likability factor, as did Barack Obama. So hot topics, will be immigration. 45% of the Latinos nationwide said immigration reform was important. 34% of them believe that the economy or job creation is important. 21% of them believe that education in schools, and 17% believe that healthcare is important. The number one reason Latinos went out to the polls this midterm election was they wanted to support the Latino community, not either party. A plurality of Latino voters nationwide, 37%, said that they were voting in the 2014 election to support a Latino community, while 34% said that they were voting to support a Democratic candidate, and 16% said that they were going out to support a Republican candidate. 2/3 of the Latinos say immigration was the most, or one of the most important issues in the voting decision. A combined 2/3 of Latino voters nationwide, 67%, said that the issue of immigration was either the most important issue in their decision to vote, and that their candidate preference, 33%, was the most or one of the most important factors in coming out to vote, and 19% of the Latino population said immigration was somewhat important. It's incredibly important. Although Latinos don't expect that the issue of immigration to be dealt with because it's a hot topic, 58% of Latinos believe that it's important because they know someone who is an immigrant. So we have to look as to whether or not these types of issues will be front and center for the presidential candidates, and whether or not either party is going to actually go out and really try to motivate the Latino elected or Latino voters, particularly when you have Ted Cruz arguing that he's going to throw his hat into the ring for the Republican president. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Other reactions to the data on the Latino vote or Latino vote this week?
We had a couple of things from the Jim Henson over at the Texas Politics Project here at UT, put up some exit polling information from yesterday's race. And this is in the governor's race. The Latino voters caught in the exit poll, 55% voted for Wendy Davis over Greg Abbott. When you split it, Latino men voted 50 to 49% for Greg Abbott, and Latino women voted 39 to 61% against Greg Abbott. So you have a split like that. In our earlier poll, we had a regular University of Texas Tribune poll that polled through the day before early voting started and came out during the week of early voting. And one of the questions that we asked in that was, what are you thinking about when you're voting for governor? What issues are on your mind? And the issue on their mind, the top of mind issue, was not just immigration. It was in particular border security. And the news item and the latest government action that I think played off of that was probably sending a bunch of National Guard troops to the border. And it came across, it translated politically, it looked to us like as a law and order issue rather than as an immigration or a foreign affairs issue. And that played toward the Republicans and was in their card deck. So when you look through the set of issues, it had less to do with which demographic group of voters are you paying attention to, and more to do with the particular demographic party. You know, this issue plays toward Republicans, that issue plays toward Democrats.
And one of the things to keep in mind is that Latinos are not a monolithic block, like say the African American community, which will go 9-1 for the Democrat most times. But typically it's 2-1 for the Democrat and the Latino community. By the way, the polling that you guys had, our polling reflected something very similar, in that Latino men were breaking a bit more evenly, whereas Latinas were breaking 2-1 for Democrats. But also keep in mind the number of Latinos that voted in this midterm election were very small. Those percentages are going to be difficult to keep up in a presidential year when the turnout is much higher. Low turnout typically favors Republicans. They tend to be more habitual voters. But regardless of what the messages were locally, whether it's border or security or anything else, this was a tidal wave. Well, maybe not a tidal wave, but it was a wave nonetheless. And had Democrats done everything right, had Battleground, had Wendy, had Leticia, had the Latino outreach been better, that would have probably taken them from 39% to say maybe 43%. But there was no stopping that wave. And it's something that's been part of a 6-year campaign to rebuild the Republican Party. They did it in 2010, they did it in 2014, Democrats had a good run at it in 2008 and 2012. We live in this, for a party that talks about not wanting to be a socialist country, they sure have nationalized elections like a socialist country. And that's the era we live in right now.
Interesting. To stay on this notion just for a moment, I think this question's for everyone. Why did we see such grand registration efforts, but not a lot of turnout accompanying them? Or is that just a media myth? So the students are reading the news and they're very excited by all of the new registration data, but perhaps we didn't see the turnout that we might expect given data about new registration. Any comments on that?
One thing we saw in our poll was there was a distinct difference in when we asked people if they agreed with the statement, my vote will make a difference, versus my vote can make a difference.
Okay.
That one word was a 10-point difference.
Really?
Because people were managing their own expectations. When you have competitive elections, or when you're perceived to have a competitive election, it boosts turnout. And when people don't think that their vote is going to make a difference, they don't really have an incentive to do it. Gerrymandering in Texas has created so many local races that are decided in the primary that people don't turn out. Look at El Paso. El Paso has like a 60% turnout in the primary, and it cuts in half in the general election. So until we get around that mindset, it's going to be tough to turn people out, and it's not something that can be done in 2 years.
Interesting, and I know that we have people watching at home, and we have a variety of students here who work on campaigns. Could they take this to a best practice? Which phrase gives the 10-point bump? My vote will?
I hope so. I mean, we tried to share it with everybody. So
There was a funny result. You know, the population's gotten bigger in 4 years. The number of registered voters has gotten bigger in 4 years. But there was about a 300,000 vote drop-off from 2010, that midterm election, to 2014. And about 280,000 of those votes, give or take, these are unofficial numbers so far, but were Democratic votes. So we have a map up on the Tribune site this afternoon that is, if you look at the state by county and look at the number of counties where the Democrats actually increased their share of the vote, or their turnout rather, only 9 counties increased. If you look at the Republican map, it's more like half the state. And so one of the things that you saw was a real drop-off in the number of overall votes, but a real growth in the margin between the Republicans and the Democrats, and in fact, a growth in the Republican raw vote overall statewide. So, you know, I can have an effect. I will have, you know, maybe or maybe not, you know, could play into that. Maybe
Sure.
they looked at it and said, eh.
Sure. I'm going to get us off topic just a tiny bit. I teach 200 students a semester. They think Ted Cruz is a hot topic. You mentioned him just a moment ago. Throwing it to the panel, any thoughts on Cruz's next move given yesterday's results?
He just won the lieutenant governor's race. You know, in a strange way. I think the Dan Patrick victory over David Dewhurst and 2 other statewide candidates was probably mapped for him by Ted Cruz's race against David Dewhurst a couple of years before that. That's the winning strain in Texas politics on the Republican side right now.
I would argue that in terms of the Senate, it will be interesting to see, and with the new Republican Senate majority, what his influence is like. It's very different being one senator in a 45-seat caucus.
31, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry?
31.
Well, in terms of
U.S. Senate.
In terms of
Oh, in terms of the U.S., okay.
yeah, in terms of the U.S. Senate versus a caucus of anywhere between 52 to 54 seats, depending on how 2 outstanding races go. So with that, and with colleagues who have joined him, who in some ways I think were characterized as just as conservative as him, he's going to have some competitors for media attention. And I think that potentially makes his influence challenged in some ways.
In terms of name recognition, because we've had this Republican wave, 20%, the latest polls I saw, 20% view him as unfavorable, and 32% have never heard of him. 15% find him somewhat favorable, and he's got 6% favorability rating nationwide. So he's got a lot of ground to make up. He's great in Texas. We're a red state, but outside of that, if he wants to be a serious contender, he has a lot of ground to make up.
Well, he has a book coming out in the spring.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, leading right up to the Iowa caucuses, I think that he has definitely look, he is a star among the Republican grassroots. But when you go into the majority, being in the majority comes with responsibility. And it's a different responsibility. You don't really have the same responsibility when you're in the minority. Mario Cuomo once said when they lost the majority, he says, well, now that we're in the minority, I hope that we're responsible, but not completely. and I think that it's a much different, going back to the question, the issue of mindset, it's a different mindset, not only because he's going to have competition with his other leaders, but because they're going to expect him that he's still a junior senator, he'll only be in his third year. And look, a lot of the far right-wing criticisms of Obama, possibly wasn't born here, was only in the Senate for 3 years. Ironically, Cruz is the same issues. So we'll see how that turns out.
I'm going to turn to some of Mr. Ramsey's language. Okay, Ross, you've described the Wendy Davis
I
campaign.
love it when they read it back to me.
Here we go. And we're pivoting to the governor's race, if you don't mind. You've described the Wendy Davis campaign as depending on a, air quote, coalition of zombies, end air quote. What do you mean?
That traveled quickly. That was this morning. Well, we were talking about this, this coalition of non-voters, and they were talking about, we're going to get people who vote infrequently, we're going to get people who don't vote, we're going to get people who, we're going to encourage people to vote who've never thought about it before, and those people didn't show up, and so that's where we came up with the coalition of zombies. It's like you created a coalition of non-voters and you didn't get any votes from it. You have to, there's a big emphasis in politics, not just in this campaign, but in a lot of places, on voter registration and the importance of voter registration. But voter registration doesn't matter if you can't peel them off the couch when it's time to vote. And the Democrats, for whatever successes they had this time, and we haven't actually seen the numbers yet, for whatever successes they had getting voters to take the first step to register, they were not successful this time, yesterday, in getting people off the couches. And so that's the coalition of zombies.
Coalition.
Nice.
Of
Using that
zombies.
to pivot to a larger conversation about the governor's race, what are your reactions? Perhaps we'll take to the Davis campaign first. Thoughts on the Davis campaign, in addition to relying on the zombies?
I don't know. I'm with Ed a little bit on this. The biggest surprise to me in the results yesterday was the magnitude. The results themselves weren't that surprising, and in fact, I think if we had this panel sitting here 12 months ago or 20 months ago and said, okay, write down your predictions and stick them in an envelope, I wouldn't be surprised if everybody said, well, the Democrats are going to get beat. It's a Republican state. It's a midterm election, the second midterm of a president. The sixth year is a bad year for presidents. It's all bad. The issue set, as I said, leans toward Republicans, law and order on the border, all of that kind of stuff. This just doesn't work. And in fact, 2 years ago when we were at the state Democratic convention, all of the conversation at that time, this is pre-Wendy Davis. Wendy Davis was merely a senator from Fort Worth. Letitia Van de Putte was merely a senator from San Antonio. Both really great senators, but not really statewide figures. So we were all kind of fishing. Who's going to run? Who's going to throw in this time? Last time it was Houston Mayor Bill White. Maybe Houston Mayor Anise Parker will jump in this time. Maybe one of those fabulous twins from San Antonio, the Castro brothers, will jump in. And all of them said just straight up, 14's not the year. Maybe 16, maybe 18, but we're not ready yet. So all the pros passed.
Nice. Other thoughts on the Davis campaign?
Progressives were ahead of schedule. It's just like Ramsey said. When Ross said.
It's okay. Could have called me a zombie.
When Battleground got on the ground in February of 2013 and got here, they planted their flag and said that it was a long-term project. My organization on the C4 side always had our sights on long-term projects. What happened in 2014 wasn't really something that was expected. It was just something that was offered, and the progressives ran with it. But no, I don't think it was anything that anyone really expected. I think that Democrats put up a good fight. They made Republicans spend money in Texas. That hasn't happened in a while. And, there is a grassroots infrastructure now on the progressive side of the aisle that previously didn't exist. So the election's lost. We're down some seats. But when you look at the grassroots membership, the email lists, the Facebook likes, the number of volunteers, that didn't exist in 2013. It didn't even exist after 2010, not to the extent that it does this time. So there is some residual benefit to this campaign that has somewhat rebuilt the progressive movement in Texas.
And I think when you look at policies, Texas has never really been a social policy state. We're not friendly to social policies, welfare policies. So when you start out arguing that you captured 15 minutes of fame because of an abortion policy, that was a difficult issue to spin off of and claim that you are the best candidate for governor in a state that is not friendly to social welfare policy. It started out as a great movement, tried to go into a party, and here you had Leticia Vanderpute that started out as a party and tried towards the end to go into a movement. It doesn't work. What does work are issues like border security, immigration, hard masculine issues, if you will, in a state that is very friendly towards this frontier cowboy attitude that we still have. So I think there's a lesson for women and perhaps the Democratic Party that they still have to find their issue and stick with it. And it's not social policies, because if it was, we'd have a great education system. But it's just not there. You shouldn't run with that type of an issue.
Can I also just jump in? The last president to have a good six-year midterm election was Bill Clinton in 1998.
Right.
And the only reason was because Republicans overplayed their hand with the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Yeah. And so Bill Clinton defied that trend. So I think one of the big things is that as we're talking about, in a midterm election, especially with the six-year itch, as it's dubbed, you have gravitational forces at play. That if you're running a campaign, you have to work with the electorate that you know is going to show up, not the electorate that you hope will show up. And I think it's great to project hope to your supporters, but behind the scenes, I would argue the campaign needs to be realistic about the electorate that's going to show up. And just in terms of registration, those efforts are fantastic in terms of registering the voters, but it's also it's almost like a public opinion poll question. Anyone can say that an issue is an important issue to them, but if you ask them then what is their chance that they're going to vote based on that issue, they're not going to vote based on that issue with the same percentage. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, was what happened with some of the registration efforts is they were registering voters, but these would be low propensity voters anyways in a midterm election campaign, that with the gravitational forces at play against Democrats, not only in Texas but across the United States, they weren't going to come out anyways.
Well, let me talk about, I'm putting my campaign hat here, and a very practical basis of voter registration is that it is about $10 a vote to register someone, and that's just the registration process. And then you have to condition them and turn them into a voter. That's really difficult, it's really expensive, you're not sure that they're going to do it. So when you have limited resources, your emphasis is, do you go out and register new voters and then try to convince them to vote? Or do you go after voters who have already demonstrated a pattern of voting history and try to get them to turn out to vote? That's an average of $3 a vote. There's a big difference there, and there's a lot less risk. So I think that's one of the reasons that registration isn't emphasized as much. Now, progressives, liberals, Democrats get flush with cash, that equation changes. But until then, they have to pick and choose. And as far as going after the drop-off voters, which my organization went after too as well, is that the problem is we did know who was going to vote, and we knew that they weren't going to be with us. We knew that we had to expand the electorate.
Right.
So that's where the zombie
Zombies, yeah.
zombie voters that came in. And they just, didn't come back to life.
Can I go backwards for just a second? I was not fishing on Facebook a minute ago. I wanted to look up, when we were talking about Ted Cruz, I talked to John Cornyn last week before the election, and the setup for this is that Cornyn's the number 2 Republican. Chances are the Republicans win the Senate. He's, the number 2 guy in the majority. If Mitch McConnell were to lose, he would be potentially the majority leader. So I said, I've known Cornyn a long time, and so I just said, so you can pretty up this question however you'd like, but are you and Cruz running in the same direction? And the answer was this, and I think it's really an interesting sort of take on where Ted Cruz is in the Senate and then where he's going to be in this presidential race. This is John Cornyn talking. Ted's experience running in a contested Republican primary in a runoff in a red state, I think, has informed a lot of the way he has approached the job. But he's a very smart, talented guy, and all of us who have come into the Senate have grown, hopefully, to learn to be more effective. It's no secret that he's looking to run for president, and I think his incentives and the Senate majority's incentives are perfectly aligned. Unless we demonstrate we're able to responsibly govern in these next 2 years leading up to the 2016 election, we have no chance of winning the White House. So they're already trying to tame him.
Interesting, interesting. I see several folks putting their cards up. We are collecting questions, and we're going to turn to those questions shortly. I mentioned that I work with a lot of students at the University of Texas. They found a few of the ads of the gubernatorial campaign to be hot topics. Any comments on the ads? And I could sharpen the question. One question that comes to us from the students, was the wheelchair ad a complicated ad, or was it a complicated ad because it was aired by a female candidate? I've fielded that 100 times this semester.
I don't think that had anything to do with being a female candidate. I think that had, I may get stoned. I think it had to do with just the tone of the ad and sort of the, heavens, the very idea that you would talk about the wheels,
And the idea of the ad was that, look, you're running against a guy who at the time was 6 points up and had like a $20 million advantage. That ad needed to go beyond commercials and needed to become news. And the way to do that was to take a risk. And they made a very compelling ad that made a lot of news. Probably wasn't a risk that paid off. But again, in the face of a wave, it's hard to say if it was the ad or if it was the wave or if it was both.
In a moment, I know that some questions are going to come up to me. I've shared again that the Annette Strauss Institute, we care about young people, we care about the future of Texas. Young people want role models. So we're going to shift from hot topics to warm and earnest just for a moment before we get the next round. In campaign 2014 or recently, or perhaps moving to 2016, are there any strong role models for young people who are running, who are surfacing? Who can our young Texans look up to? Any favorite politicians at this moment in time?
Wow, left field. If you're a young Democrat, I would say probably the Castros. Mm-hmm. If you're a young Republican, there's we've joked that this is that George P. Bush is either some combination of Fresh Prince was one thing we were calling him in the newsroom, and Simba was the other one, the Lion King. But I think he's a comer on that side. So
nice.
I would probably put out, in terms of looking for role models, I would put out a warning that it is so easy to find a role model based on something like media coverage. Media coverage does not in any way equate to effectiveness in terms of doing your job. It equates to your role in getting media coverage. And one of the ultimate effects of not only our election system, not only of our campaign finance system, not only of increased polarization in the United States, not only of redistricting, et cetera, is that the incentives for members of Congress have changed in a lot of ways such that it is now in the best interests of individuals to get media coverage. And I think that younger individuals need to be cautious about, on both sides, about individuals who seek the limelight and ask, what is the record behind it? What can be backed up with that?
Yeah, I'd have to say, I think he's, I have to agree with him. I think younger people are turning to becoming politically informed on social media. In fact, the Pew Hispanic Research came out with a study that said 28% of people get their information from their iPhones or smartphones or online sources. And we have David Duvers. We had Dan Patrick spend over $1 million on Facebook running a perfect campaign, shutting off the media. So you have to be cautious of what you find on social media, because the politicians know that that's what you're looking for, and they're going to cater to that, and you have to figure out what is a role model for you.
We live in an era where people are famous for being famous. And politics is no different. So if you can find what you really love, what you're really interested, what really motivates you, and find a role model that emulates that. I know abortion's not the issue we like to talk about in Texas a whole lot, but Cecile Richards is an icon in that movement. Cesar Chavez was an icon in the farm workers movement. I went to UCLA. John Wooden was brainwashed into our brains the whole time we were there, but these were role models that, for better or for worse, we all follow. I mean, there are business leaders that I look to as mentors to help manage my organization. And I follow what they do, and I study what they do, and I read up on them every chance I can get. They get a fair amount of media coverage, but really they get the media coverage because of what they're doing.
The role models are the people that are really, really, really great at what you really, really want to do. If what you want to be is famous, follow one of those. If what you want to do is be effective, follow one of those. They have in politics and in business, there are workhorses and there are show horses, and you have to decide which one you are, which mix you are, and follow that. Just, be self-aware enough to say, what I really want to do is this, and chase it.
Wonderful, thank you. Here come the questions from the audience, and I will follow Director Lawrence's routine. So this comes from Brian from UT Austin, and his question is, why did Democratic candidates do so poorly when liberal ballot measures such as legalizing marijuana, raising the minimum wage, and granting access to abortions do so well?
I'm going to read, I screen capped this because I knew this might come up. I saw a tweet yesterday that said, and you may know this one because it's been retweeted 15,000 times, but it says, so voters want higher minimum wage, legalized marijuana, abortion access, and GOP representation. Okay then. Look, branding goes a long way. And you can believe in certain issues, but you can associate with a brand regardless of what those issues are. And that happens a lot in politics, actually. And in a state like Texas, when districts are gerrymandered so much, it doesn't matter what the issues are because the deck is stacked.
We had a question in our polling a few years ago, again, a UT Texas Tribune poll, that we asked people what they thought about legalizing marijuana, and they had, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but we had a group, small amounts for personal use, any amount doesn't matter, ought to be allowed, small amounts for personal use, medicinal amounts ought to be used, and generally the spectrum was that under some condition or another, most people thought marijuana was okay. And in another part of the poll, we asked, if the state of Texas was looking for money, would you favor these things: legalization of casinos, legalization of marijuana? And if you said legalization of marijuana next to the word tax, all of a sudden Texas was against it. So it's all in how you spend it. We're all for marijuana. We're all against marijuana taxes.
Incidentally, by the way,
I hope we
59% supported it in your poll.
Was it 59%?
It was 59%. Yeah. It's one of the issues we work on.
Why do you remember that?
My friend told me. On the same subject, though, and words, branding matters, because we have, so marijuana is one of the issues we work on at the Texas Research Institute, and legalization or decriminalization are one of them. When we pose the question in Texas, do you favor marijuana regulation? People who are all in favor of legalization, as Texans, they hear the word regulation.
Right.
No, I'm not in favor of that. All right. Well, what about marijuana policy reform? Oh, absolutely. It's all in the branding, man.
I would also say that especially in a midterm election, in this particular midterm election, the candidates that were running and winning in the states that were voting to legalize marijuana and overturning voting against personhood in Colorado, for example, were not necessarily running on those particular issues. They were running against Barack Obama. Mm. And that, I think, is one of the big things to keep in mind, is voters weren't, and I haven't seen the data on this, but my hypothesis would be voters weren't connecting the two. Voters weren't connecting the issue stances of the candidates they were voting for on these particular issues. They were just voting for whether or not, you can look at, for example, Kentucky, for example. The polls up until the very final days had Mitch McConnell slightly ahead, yesterday it broke open and he won by 15 points. And one of the big reasons that voters cited in exit polls was because they thought that Senate control was important. Voters in Kentucky don't like Mitch McConnell. They don't. They think he's highly effective, though, and they wanted Republicans to control the Senate. And I think that's what you see in a lot of these races is voters weren't voting for candidates connected to these issues. They were voting for candidates connected to a different set of issues, mostly having to do with Barack Obama.
Nice. This next question comes to us from Anonymous at the University of Texas. And it is this: can Battleground Texas survive such a large defeat?
Well, stay tuned because they're going to be here later.
It's a great question. They pitched themselves initially, and I think honestly, as this is a long-term program. Don't expect results in 2014. And then Wendy Davis came along, and the prospect of a decent candidate that they didn't expect, and maybe this is an accelerant, and they wrapped their campaign around Wendy Davis, and they share her fate. And now the problem is that, they wrapped themselves around a candidate who turned in the worst performance of any candidate since Ann Richards. So they got to live with that, and they're going to, their elevator pitch now is really hard. When they go back to those donors and those supporters and they say, okay, so we've got our first election under our belt, and we're ready for more support, and we're ready for more help, and you should help us because blank. And blank's a hard thing to do right now.
I mean, the losses that Battleground suffered were the losses that everybody suffered, and not just in Texas. So I think it's unfortunate the way the numbers shook out in this race, but you can't deny that everybody got hit by the same wave.
Nice. If additional questions are coming, Ariel still is in the back if you want to put your card up. This next question also doesn't have an author, but why is Leticia Van de Putte not able to get traction with Hispanic voters? Or how much support does she have with Hispanic leaders? Does she move the ball for Democrats with Hispanics?
Oh, great question. Jeez, anyone want to take a stab?
I haven't seen any exit polling on it. Part of the problem here is that there were not that many Hispanic voters. For all we know, she moved 100% of them, and it didn't turn this thing. I think, when you just sort of got in small groups and watched how the candidates worked, and this was both watching the Republicans in small groups and watching the Democrats in small groups, she's clearly a charismatic candidate, and crowds, even crowds that don't know her, are warm to her. So, the elements were there, but, a combination of limited resources and the year she was in, I think, hurt that campaign.
You also can't underestimate the fact that her name is Van de Putte, right? And I think that if it was Gonzalez or Espinoza or anything else, that it would have been different. And I mean, I have done a lot of Latino organizing in California, Nevada, and here. And I remember particularly in 2010, I was doing Latino Vote for Harry Reid, and he was running for the U.S. Senate. His son, Rory Reid, was running for governor. You had two Reids on the ballot, same election, same voters. Sandoval, who was running for governor, got a 16-point bump. Because people went into the voting booth and they voted for Harry Reid, and then they saw Sandoval and they said, whoa, I'm going to gravitate towards there. You can't underestimate that.
Name recognition, I think, was a very difficult obstacle for her to overcome. She can't seem too Latino because she needs the white Anglo vote, particularly the white female Anglo vote. But yet she has to be identifiable to the Latino community. So the code switching she would do on TV and in her speeches, I don't think helped her very much in a state that where you cannot win only on the Latino vote. I don't care how many Latinos come out. It's just not there. I think she had that working against her, and of course funds. When you're running two women at a very top seats, one of them's going to get more, and people are going to go with the one that has, they believe, perception-wise, has greater appeal. So all the money was going towards Wendy Davis. Leticia Van de Putte struggled, and finances is a huge factor. And when you have organizations like Battleground wrapping themselves around Wendy Davis, and when they're going out to the Texas-Mexico border and they're not really pushing Leticia Van de Putte, or in very mixed demographic counties and cities, the obstacle is even greater. So timing, And having two females at the top ticket, I think, hurt.
I would also just add that we shouldn't dismiss the possibility, or really the very real likelihood, that in both of these cases, with Wendy Davis and with Letitia Van de Putte, that you do have a prominent gender effect here. Mary Landrieu, the senator from Louisiana, in the final days of this campaign, came under some fire in terms of her comments about what it is to run as a white woman in the South. And how difficult it is for a white woman to run and win in the South. There are structural barriers that women face in terms of running for office. Financing is one of many. We can't underestimate that hidden X factor that we might not be able to quantify, but also might and does exist in the electorate.
Someone was reading your mind, Dr. Scacco. Here's the next question. It's actually from Dr. Lawrence. Maybe we should be paying more attention when we talk about voter turnout to whites and men than to women and Latinos. There's a hot one. Okay, I'll read it again. Maybe we should be paying more attention when we talk about voter turnout to whites and men than to women and Latinos. And actually I have some data on this. We have a database here at the University of Texas. It's the largest text base of campaign communication on the planet. Labor Day to Election Day, 1948 to 2012, all of our presidential campaigns, news coverage, speeches, debates, ads, etc. And you're absolutely right. We see far more attention in the press to demographics and the uncertainty of the swing vote, the independent voter, the Latino vote, than to the folks that you're identifying are voting. So reaction, should we be paying more attention to whites and men?
But what do you mean by paying more attention, though?
It just seems that the conversation is, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be talking about the other groups, but I'm sort of trying to be provocative here, because we spend a lot of time, we have spent a lot of time this campaign season wondering what it's going to take to get Latinos in particular, young people, other groups that are undermobilized, get them to turn out. And I feel like I don't see the comparable attention to the people who do really reliably turn out.
So in other words, how do we persuade the likely electorate?
Well, what was the Democratic, the Democrats, and the Republicans were going after Hispanic voters. And the idea was Hispanic voters are Democratic voters, but I'm going to get 40%. This is Greg Abbott talking. I'm going to try to get 40% of those voters. Where was the Democratic effort for white men in Collin County, for example?
Well, according to our polling, the Democratic effort for white men in Collin County would be better spent elsewhere because that was not a movable block. And that's what it comes down to. Look, I believe that there are very few swing voters left in America. There's maybe 1 million out of a country of 300 million. We live in a country of blue voters and red voters and blue non-voters and red non-voters. And that thin slice in the middle are the ones that we're trying to win over. So when you're looking at, say, white men, they're overwhelmingly red voters. And they're either not going to be persuaded to vote for a Democrat or they're going to stay home. And the groups that you hear us talking about, us as political professionals, what's the African American turnout going to be like? It's because you know where that vote's going to go, and you know that it doesn't turn out at the same rate as, like, say, white men. So that's why we talk about the demographics. The focus is a lot on Latinos because it's the fastest growing community in America. We are everywhere, or half of this panel. But also because it is probably the most persuasive voting bloc out there right now. So those two things make our community a very compelling bloc to chase.
We are not bound to parties. We will vote. We'll cross the party line. So yeah, it's a little more sexy, as a political group, I think.
We have a follow-up question for Ed from the audience. So why do Democrats always lose the branding battle?
That's a good question. We didn't lose it in 2008. Didn't lose it in 2012. The type of voter that shows up in a midterm election versus the type of voter that shows up in a presidential election are two very different types of voters. And I think that when you look at it at a more general level, like in a presidential year level, the Democrats tend to do better because the issues that Democrats talk about tend to be the ones that occasional voters tune into a bit more. The environment, abortion, gay marriage, health care. But when you get into a midterm election, the issues become different and the branding is different.
And I don't think it's the loss of the brand. I think I would argue it goes back to demographics, which is that the Democrats during the course of President Obama's, administration have not perfected the art of getting their base out during a midterm election. Republicans have been better at it. In terms of the coalition of voters that put Obama in the White House in 2008 and again in 2012, this coalition of voters is less likely to turn out during a midterm. And so I would argue that I would probably spin the question and say it's not necessarily about losing the battle. It's just that individuals didn't necessarily feel it necessary yesterday to vote for their brand. And oftentimes that happens with a particular product.
Or that certain voters, one of the things we have found is that people who only vote every 4 years, they say they hit every election. They vote every election and never miss it because in their mind, voting is like the Olympics. It happens every 4 years. It's not something they realize voting doesn't happen every 2 years. Voting happens every year. Most people show up every 2 years. A lot of people show up every 4. Sorry, other way around. Most people show up every 4. You get what I'm saying. The point is that a lot of Democratic voters see voting as something that happens every 4 years. So,
and I'd add as well, just onto that really the brands of both major parties right now stink.
yeah.
According to exit polls yesterday, approval of both parties is in the low 40s. This was not in any way a victory for a Republican brand in any kind of way. And I think that because you have Republicans themselves saying today, this is absolutely not a victory for the Republican brand.
Well, it's why the zombies outnumber the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, that's an exit poll. The people who actually felt the need to get off the couch and go vote were 40% against them. The people who didn't get off the couch were, probably, it'd be interesting to see that poll.
Right. Look at the growth in people who identify themselves as Tea Party or progressives and not Democrats or Republicans.
Right.
So our C4 organization is called Progress Texas. We are in the digital space, we are now the biggest 501c4 group in Texas. Battleground is a PAC. We are 501c4. They're bigger. But as far as C4s go, we're the biggest, and part of that is because people aren't necessarily identifying with party brands as much as they are issues. And they feel more comfortable doing that. They feel a little bit more independence and a little bit more freedom.
Next question comes from the audience. Let's talk about Wendy Davis's autobiography. Good move, ?
She released it in September of this year when people were starting to focus on the election. If she'd released it a year earlier, if they'd had it available and it had been, if this was a possible thing to do, if they'd released it a year earlier, they would have started with her bio in some kind of final form. And if you remember the first part of this race, it was a battle over exactly what her bio was and what exactly happened and is this story straight and are we getting, they planted their flag badly in the beginning and the biography that came out in September was almost like a rebranding effort. I just wonder about the sequencing of that.
It seems to me that if I were managing the race, the reason I want a book to come out in September is because that's how I can get a lot of free media, especially running against a guy who's got a mountain of money. I could do a book tour.
And she did.
Yeah. And as far as the contents of the biography, I think the reason you put something like that, and we're talking about her abortions, that you put something like that in there because it's going to come out, and you try to get ahead of it by inoculating it. And the way you do that is to put it out yourself.
But either way, it really didn't help her. So.
Well, but now after that book came out, she did. I mean, there were polls that showed her within 6 points. Granted, they were internal polls, but even some of our polls showed her closing the gap. But once October came, and man, just blew up.
I want to. It's easy, I would say, to attack the biography that might not necessarily be what the median voter's biography is. That I think is, and to be fair, most of the biographies that we know of, the scripts that we know of as voters, as citizens, are white male biographies. Served in a war, I, started a business, made X number of profits, I did X, Y, and Z, I'm a brain surgeon, whatever. When you get a different biography that in a lot of ways challenges that dominant frame, and again, this is a cultural and a structural issue that female candidates face for office, you're going to have more media scrutiny of that compared to the dominant traditional frame that has been portrayed in the media up until that point.
We have high school students watching and many college students in the room pivoting on this notion. Is there a perfect candidate biography? Is there an ideal biography?
The ones that work.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like an escalating war. This biography works here. Bob Dole's biography works in Kansas at this time.
Yeah.
Barack Obama's biography works in America at that time.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton's biography work. They're temporal. It's like that worked last time, but once somebody's done that, the first astronaut's biography really can't be done again. Now you're the second astronaut.
In politics, we like to say the right answer is never yes or no. It depends.
Nice. The next round of questions have all shifted to the future. So here comes a question from the audience. What do the midterm results mean for the upcoming legislative session?
I think the Republicans who won yesterday, this is actually the column I just wrote for Friday, so thanks. The Republicans who won yesterday really won their elections last spring, if you think about it. This was, the Democrats, for a variety of reasons, couldn't overcome all of the regular obstacles that were already in place. It's a Republican state. It's a Democratic president, all of that kind of stuff. And the Republicans, when they're 5 or 6 years down the road from here, and you say, what was your race like in 2014, are probably going to talk about their primaries and not about their general elections. Dan Patrick's going to talk about a scathing primary where he had to defend his biography and ran against 3 sitting statewide officials. That's where those races were. And what was interesting to me, I moderated the lieutenant governor's debate in the general election. And to me, the thing that leapt out of that was that a couple of things. One of them, you were talking about code switching a minute ago. Patrick didn't call her Leticia the whole time. He called her Letitia. And, it's just we're taking all, I think her campaign was really sensitive to that later. But what was notable about that debate was that he was on the same issues and in largely the same tone in the general election that he was in the primary. We're used to candidates tacking back toward the middle when they get to the general election. He felt no need to do that. And I think having won a general election with these numbers, having talked like a primary candidate through the general election, I think you can expect him to govern that way as a lieutenant governor.
2011 legislative session was the Tea Party session, and that was really, is raucous the right way to
It was fun
to describe that?
Great for journalism.
And 213, by way of comparison, was relatively tame until the special session and the filibuster. So if I had to guess, I'd say 2015 might be a cross between the two.
I think you're going to see the same sort of language that he ran with reflected in the lieutenant governor's bully pulpit. So.
Yep, agreed.
This question comes to us from Anonymous from St. Edward's University, and it's an earnest one too, so this kind of warms it up a bit. Is our generation's use of social media rendering us hopeless in the voting booth? Are we losing faith? To anyone, to the scholars, the journalists, the observers.
Well, we've done a lot of polling on it too. You said the Pew research shows 28% get their news from the internet or social media. We found 25%. The number jumps to 40% when you look at people age 40 and under. Yeah, I think social media, there's something that's really interesting we saw this year. Our highest polling issues were education funding, equal pay, and anti-corruption measures. And when we tried to push those issues online, they weren't nearly successful as marijuana and gay marriage. And the reason is that we behave differently online. We don't want to engage in the same type of conversations we do as in person. We want to wave the equivalent of a rainbow flag on the internet and effectively demonstrate. So I think that it's a great place to get news. People are learning that you have to take some of what you're reading with a grain of salt, and that you have to get it from trusted sources. The problem is that a trusted source means different things to different people. Some people think MSNBC is a trusted source. Some people think Fox is a trusted source. Some people think Uncle Willie is a trusted source. So I do think that people can filter through it. The problem is there's a lot to filter through.
People are learning to, they're learning to do sort of a personal version of journalism. People are learning to discern. And, the thing about opening all these pipes at the same time is, you're immediately covered in garbage. It's like, there used to be a line that 100%, 100 things happen in the world, 10% of them make the wires, 1% of them make the newspapers. And it's because all of the people that were trained to filter, whether you like those filters or don't, they were performing a function and you were getting filtered information. And in social media, we're suddenly asking people to ingest a lot more unfiltered information, and I think the amount of unfiltered information is a little bit ahead of their discernment abilities. But I think they're catching up. I think people are learning to, I trust that, I don't trust that, I do, there's, just on its face, it's hard to tell one from the other.
Yeah. This next one is also anonymous. Why is President Obama's approval rating low? Why was he so toxic for Democrats?
So I'll start with this. Usually by the 6th year in a presidency, most presidents are quite unpopular. It's just the nature of politics. It's the nature of governing. It's the fact that presidents set particular expectations of their performance that they try to meet, but ultimately face the challenges of office and can't meet. Whether that is President Bush suddenly facing a national catastrophe at the beginning of his presidency and having to rearrange priorities, or President Obama coming into office trying to close Guantanamo Bay and then realizing that he can't do that on his own, and that there's significant congressional opposition to that. So these things add up, and it's important to understand that what happened to President Obama is very similar to what happened to President George W. Bush in 2006. It happened to Ronald Reagan in 1986. This is a traditional 6-year itch, and by this point in a president's administration, voters have traditionally soured on the incumbent. They're potentially looking for something new. They're looking ahead. Not only that, but the chatter about the next presidential race, I think, has individuals looking past this current president and wondering what's next.
And it's compounded by the fact that we're in a red state.
Nice.
He's more unpopular than he was. He's less popular than he was in the blue states. He's more unpopular than he was in the red states.
Nice. And our final question for our session comes from Alvaro Rodriguez. He's a UT graduate and a BGTX fellow. And in keeping with some of the goals of this session, of the Strauss Institute, it's a warm one. How could you freshen up politics in America?
A little nip, a little tuck.
Politics has become very dark because it appeals to people's fears. They think that tapping into those emotions drags people out. But we have an ability to talk about things in the positive. And I think that people are much more responsive to something when you talk about it in the positive. Look, we're guilty of talking about stuff in the negative as well. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you want to put thought-provoking issues out, and maybe you want to have a little fun with them. And you can make them a little bit more positive, they will be a little bit more engaging. But that's hard to do.
Yeah, Bill Clinton came out with a statement saying that there's no conflict in politics. It's not interesting.
Yeah.
And it really isn't. When nothing's going on, no one's paying attention. There was really no need to put any sort of wedge issues on the midterm elections in Texas because we're a red state, so it was going to go red a long time ago. and all of, parties in politics is systemic. It's structural. It's larger than us individuals, and it'll continue going on its evolution and keep moving in a direction. And the patterns aren't different. This is typical in a midterm election.
One of the things that we could ask ourselves is what is making our politics not fresh? And I think one of the big things would be the influence of money in campaigns. You've seen over the past several election cycles that the influence of outside third-party political action committees coming into races, particularly, and I think this is important, races that are below the media's radar at the state legislative level, not only in Texas but also across the United States. When you have small legislative districts and you have an outside group coming in, dropping $1 million, and then getting out, that obviously is going to have some type of effect. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is if we want to freshen up politics, one of the ways that could potentially be done is getting money out of politics, is getting the large sums of money out of politics.
People like a good argument. The biggest frenzy of voting we had in Texas in the last, recent history was when, the Democratic presidential nomination unexpectedly made it all the way to Texas without being decided. And we were suddenly thrown into this battle between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And voting on the I'm going to screw up the numbers because it's been a while since I looked at them, but voting on the Democratic side in that primary in 2008 was like 2.4 times normal. Voting in the Republican primary, where nothing was going on, was 1.5 times normal, just because they were attracted to a fight too. People like a good argument. You don't have to be necessarily nasty about it. That was a hard fight that they were in, but it wasn't a particularly nasty fight when they got to Texas. It was just really engaging, and people felt like they were pulling for their candidate and involved in something. They were engaged.
And that might actually be a way to rephrase the question, how do you freshen up politics? How do you increase engagement? And I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is competitive elections drive turnout. And look at Austin, for example, which just had 10 council districts with no incumbents, and Bruce turnout was like 41% in the county, right? Well, in Harris County, it was 33%. Almost 10 points lower because there wasn't as much competition there locally. My vote can make a difference.
Will make a difference.
Can.
It's can? Okay.
Manage expectations.
We must end on that line. My vote can make a difference. Just a few announcements, if I may. It is now 5:45. We invite you to enjoy some appetizers in the foyer area, perhaps to ask an additional question of our panelists if they are on their way out. The next session starts at 6. Please, thank you all. Join me in thanking you for your questions and our panelists for their fine answers. Thank you very much.